Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to be focusing on middle childhood physical development. So we are focusing on school age children from 6 to about 12 years old. So this is the period between early childhood and early adolescence. And we're not diving into gross and fine motor too much in this lecture because mainly what we're seeing is increasements in agility and persistence, as well as balance control and body movement. So you'll see in your text that it goes into a little bit more detail on the motor movements. So we're going to focus specifically on physical activity as well as brain development and what that looks like for our physical movements. So we do see during this time that children's muscles are becoming stronger. This also includes their larger body organs such as their heart and their lungs, so they're able to have increased longevity in their running and their exercise periods, and we see that there is more opportunity for organized sports during this time. So stay tuned to learn a little bit more about elementary school age children and physical development. Physical activity has many benefits for overall health of children. So it's not just their health of their lungs, their hearts, their muscles, and other inner working body parts, but we do see that there's better overall health mentally, physically, emotionally, socially for children. We do see that we have less opportunity for movement when children don't spend as much time outside, and this can increase the likelihood of obesity. So spending more time in active play and getting our bodies moving reduces childhood obesity. We also see that there are more opportunities for children to engage in teamwork and gameplay, and so there's an appreciation of cooperation and fair play. We also see that children have improved problem-solving abilities as well as respect for their teammates and opponents, and this includes all different kinds of nationalities and ethnicities. So when we create opportunities for physical activity that allow for all diverse backgrounds to be included, children are more likely to engage in teamwork and they're more likely to be cooperative with one another. I did include a video clip here that's about 5 or 6 minutes that supports this information. So thinking about our physical education, once children start to get to the school ages, they are engaging in physical education during recess as well as having classes dedicated to PE. And so we do see that there are lots of opportunities for teamwork and collaboration that teachers can create during this time frame. When looking at research related to childhood obesity, we see that it's at its highest when children are in middle childhood, so again around 6 to 12 years old. We see that about 18% of children in the United States during 2012 were obese, and that childhood obesity has actually doubled since the 80s in both Mexico, United States, and Canada. And not only is obesity correlated to children having less opportunities to engage in physical activity, but it also correlates with asthma, high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol. So we do see that when children have asthma, they are engaging in activities that might cause shortness of breath, chest tightness, coughing, and so this is a chronic disease of the respiratory system that causes inflammation and narrows the airways in our noses and our mouths, and it causes difficulty in breathing. And so the more children who have obesity, the more children who have asthma. And there are actually some children in city schools that use inhalers to support their asthma, but mainly we see that children around this time frame of middle childhood are starting to need inhalers and support for asthma. This also could be connected to where children live, so the area or community that they're living in could be a cause for increased asthma, but we do see that one of the correlating factors is children who are overweight, and so when the excessive weight builds, average school achievement decreases, self-esteem decreases, and children are just not as active. And so we can look at childhood obesity by measuring the body mass index. So this is also known as BMI. So basically this just calculates the ratio of our weight to our height. So this isn't just done in childhood, but anybody can measure their BMI. And so if you're to calculate your weight and your height ratio, and it's divided by the weight in pounds, and you can see, do I have an average or normal body mass index? Now, there are some things to consider when looking at body mass index. Your water intake, also there are differences for boys and girls, and it also is something that can be slightly different depending on how much muscle mass you have. So your body mass index may be higher than typically average if you have a higher muscle mass, because muscle actually takes up less space than it does fat, but it weighs more. And so this is just to kind of show some of the standards for childhood obesity as well as childhood overweight areas. So within the 85th percentile according to the Center for Disease Control within the 80s, and then for obesity within the 95th percentile. So do consider that impacts of COVID, increased TV usage, as well as unhealthy foods are also contributing factors to obesity and being overweight. And so the importance of getting outside, getting active, recognizing physical activity is an important key component within our school systems, can support children maintaining and having healthy weight. On this slide, I've included a little bit of information related to brain development. This is going to support the areas when we're talking about developmental delays and disabilities. So thinking about the different areas of brain development that may be impacted when we're considering if children do have learning disabilities. So for example, we're looking at the speed of thought. So this is our reaction time. So how long it takes us to respond to stimuli, either physically with movement or cognitively with thought. So if a ball, for example, is thrown at us during PE time, how long does it take us to respond to that stimuli? So how long does it take us to open and close our fist to grab that ball, or to turn our bodies to go and kick the ball back? Also our attention, so our ability to concentrate on stimuli. So if we are playing a game of ping pong, for example, are we able to focus on the game for an extended amount of time, or will our attention waver off to other elements within our environment? This can also be selective attention. So if, for example, we have difficulty with adverse stimuli within our environment, we may be paying attention to the airplane or the door that's shutting, and we might have a harder time focusing on what's right in front of us, the task at hand. We also see automaticity. I was reading it and then my brain didn't process it, so my speed of thought and reaction time for processing was not going through. So the process of which repetition of sequence of thoughts and actions makes a sequence routine, so that no longer requires conscientious thought. So we're thinking about how long it takes us to process information and the repetition of that information. And this is something that comes into play when we're thinking about a game, for example. If we are out on the field and we're playing a game of dodgeball, how long is it taking us to process that step by step of, I'm going to throw the ball to you, and then I'm going to watch to see who you're going to pass it to next, and then I'm going to make sure that I move my body from the front to the back of the court. So there are different sequences of the routine to play a game. Now this could be different depending on if we're engaging in a gross motor or fine motor game. If we're playing chess, for example, the process and sequence of the repetition to make different moves and to anticipate what's going to happen next, being steps ahead, that could be something that requires us to have automation within that game. So again, different areas of brain development that can directly contribute to areas of physical activity that we may be engaging in. On this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about physical disabilities. So I'm not going into great detail related to different types of physical disabilities. I'm just explaining what they mean. So there are different areas of physical disabilities that we might categorize people in. So they may have neurological, musculoskeletal, or health concerns. So some of the areas of health concerns that we might see for physical disabilities are asthma or diabetes, and we have seen research to show that children can have early onset diabetes if they are overweight or obese. Some of the examples of physical disabilities related to the neurological and musculoskeletal areas of the body may include cystic fibrosis. They might also include children who have been born with birth defects or a spinal cord injury. So there are many different areas of a physical disability that a child could have, and some could be at birth and some could come later on. So if a child was in an injury early on, this could contribute to them having a physical disability. And we see that physical disabilities can impact play and learning that require motor skills. So for example, if a child has limited motor abilities in their hands, fingers, and wrist, this can contribute to them having difficulty engaging in activities where they might be writing or they might be grabbing onto different materials. If they have limited or impacted mobility or no mobility in their legs or lower bodies, or for example, if they're paralyzed from the waist down, this could contribute to them having impacted play out on the playground, so climbing on play structures. So there's a lot of research to show that our areas where children would engage in gross motor play or physical activity, specifically out on the playground at school, are limiting for children who have physical disabilities, and we need to think about how do we create accessibility in those areas so that they can engage and increase social interaction. So as we were talking about earlier, physical activity is a great opportunity for children to engage with others and have social emotional connections and problem solve and have cooperative skills increased. But if we have children who have physical disabilities or motor delays, which are potentially areas that we might see happening on the playground of social interaction time, this could be impacted. And especially if we are catering to the needs of children too strongly and we're doing everything for them instead of creating opportunities that actually allow them to participate, this may impact their ability to connect with one another, to also feel confident and have self-esteem increased. We also see that we might have less access to play materials and equipment. So for example, if we are considering children who are going to go and engage in an obstacle course, do our friends who are using a walker or a wheelchair have accessibility to participate with those play materials and engage in that activity? Also, we might have less access to proper positioning equipment. So in the classroom, children might not be able to reach the desk because their wheelchair has limited mobility to raise up and down, or even to be able to sit on the floor with children to play with the blocks or to utilize the different kinds of art materials that we're using in a project or a collaborative art project. I said project twice. I meant a self-independent project or a collaborative project. So do consider that the opportunities that are present within a school system may be limiting for children who have physical disabilities. Same with if they have health concerns. So if we're engaging in activities that require a lot of movement, and a child has asthma, this could limit the amount of time spent on that activity. Same with the child who has diabetes. I remember that I had a friend when I was playing soccer around this time frame, and she had diabetes and had to pause during our soccer game so that she could go and check her glucose and insulin and make sure that her blood sugar levels were regulated during that time. And I remember she carried around a bag of Skittles to make sure that she had enough glucose in her body, and this did impact her ability to play at the same time frame that everybody else did, and she would have to take more frequent breaks. I myself have experienced asthma, and it started a little bit later on, but it did impact my ability to participate in running activities, and I wasn't able to keep up at the same rate of speed as some of my peers during that time. So do see the connection that if we don't have equitable opportunities for physical disabilities within our spaces, that this could be limiting for social interaction for children. On this slide, we have information to talk about intellectual and learning disabilities. So learning disabilities do focus on IQ achievement discrepancies and processing disorders, ADHD. So funny, as I'm reading this slide, I actually have ADHD myself, so being able to talk about this openly is great, and being able to connect with children who might have similar areas of learning disabilities or delays than you can be helpful when you want to work with them, because you have a better understanding of what this kind of area of learning looks like for them and different ways that you can support them. So the DSM-5 recognizes specific learning disorders disorders as something that includes disabilities in both perception and processing, so how we perceive information and stimuli and how we process it. And so this is directly connected to reading, math, writing, and spelling. And on the next slide, you'll see that I talk specifically about different kinds of learning disabilities in these areas of school achievement and what that looks like. So we do see that children who have specific learning disorders or disabilities have potentially lower achievement within schools. This doesn't mean that they are unable to participate within the school system, but we might need additional support set in place to create opportunities for them to engage in reading, mathematics, writing, and spelling. And we also see that learning disorders are now combined with diagnoses of deficits related to perception or processing information. And so this is just referred to a learning disability. I'm not going into great detail on all areas of learning disabilities, but the reason why it's important to think about learning disabilities is because when we're thinking about children in the elementary school age, majority of their time spent in school is focused on IQ achievement, and so students are required to take tests related to measuring their intelligence, aptitude, or ability to learn in school. And so we see that this is defined by their chronological age, and we see that achievement tests are specifically focusing on reading skills, mathematics, writing, science, or other subjects. On this slide, you'll see I've included some learning disabilities specifically that we may focus on when we're thinking about children's performance levels within schools and IQ testing, as well as state testing. So these areas are looking at reading, spelling, math, and writing abilities, as well as children's overall processing abilities for learning. And so personally, I like to say that these are the 4 Ds of learning disabilities just to make it easier on my memory, but dyslexia is specifically focusing on reading and spelling. Dyscalculia is specifically focusing on math, and I like to think of this one as calcula, calculator. Okay, that one focuses on math. For dysgraphia, this is focused on spelling and writing, and I like to think of this one as a graph, so something that you would write and spell with. You would make a graph or a chart of something, and then dyspraxia is the overall ability for our brain to process information, and this one specifically can be connected to coordination and movement. So when we're thinking about how we might process the next steps in throwing a ball or moving that chess piece, this may also impact our ability to coordinate those movements. So I might have difficulty in not only thinking about those next steps, but moving my body to correspond with the second or third step in that process. So do consider that all of these areas of learning disabilities can be directly connected to children's ability to increase their IQ achievement and testing scores. And so if we have knowledge of where children are at in terms of reading, spelling, and mathematics, as well as writing skills, this can better support us in knowing what kinds of areas they need more help in during school time. So if they're having difficulty in math because they have dyscalculia, maybe we need to set more supports in place, and what can we do as instructors as well as our families. So having knowledge of this is very important. On this slide, I wanted to include some learning disorders that we may see children are diagnosed with during this time frame. Now, we are noticing that in recent years, we're able to get diagnoses earlier on before children enter grade school. So before middle childhood, around the preschool years, even as early as 2 years old, children can be diagnosed with disorders like autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And so if we're looking at autism, we see that this is an impairment of social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, and children have restricted and repetitive behaviors. So some of these repetitive and stereotypical manipulation of object behaviors may include children stemming or flapping. We also see that there could be poor social skills. Children could engage in tiptoe walking, or they might engage in self-injurious behaviors. So it is important to keep an eye out if you're noticing these kinds of behaviors that do not seem typical as children are in preschool, and this could be a lead way for a developmental deficit known as autism. And so this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and we do see that many children with autism are on a spectrum and they are gifted artists. So I actually had the opportunity to meet a child when I was at a local park when I was a nanny one time, and this child, not knowing at first, but after interacting with them, I was able to gather that they did have autism after talking with the parent or grandparent that they were with at the time, and they were fascinated and had highly increased knowledge related to sprinklers. Had no idea anything about sprinklers before I met this child, but they were gifted in being able to know all of the different types of sprinklers within the park, the different kinds of spigots that each sprinkler had, what they did, the types of materials that were used. It was fascinating. But this child engaged in conversation only related to this type of interest for them, and they engaged in repetitive conversation related to this. Now, this child specifically did have some verbal skills, but their social interactions were different than the typically developing children that I were working with. And so when they would start to engage in conversation about other things, this child was only able to focus on their interest and fascination. Now, again, autism is a spectrum disorder, so we may see a wide variety of social interaction. We may see that some children engage in no communication at all verbally, and it's all nonverbal communication. And so we often see that many children who have autism utilize picture communication boards or picture exchange communication, also known as PECs. And so this is something that you might see with little picture cards that have different tasks. So it might be brushing teeth or eating or going down the slide. And a lot of children may also use communication devices on tablets or iPads. So there's many different things that we might see with autism spectrum disorder. And we see, again, parents usually notice signs within the first 2 years, but diagnoses don't typically come around until age 3. So again, there is repetitive and stereotypical manipulation of objects, and children may have impacted ability to engage in social interactions, so their language skills, shared attention or interests in objects. Another learning disorder that may impair personal, social, or academic functioning is ADHD. So I did include a little video here to support that if you were interested in learning a little bit more about ADHD. And so ADHD is higher in the US than in most nations, and we see that the definition of ADHD remains the same in the DSM-5 in comparison to some other areas that have been adjusted for learning disorders and disabilities. And it specifically states that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder defined by impairing levels of inattention, disorganization, or hyperactivity, impulsivity. And so we see that children who have ADHD have characteristics of inattention, impulsiveness, and hyperactivity. And so some of these may look like being easily distracted from tasks or activities. So children may have a harder time staying on task at any given moment. We may see that children might walk around or leave the classroom suddenly during assignments or activities, or they may start to talk with one another or find something else that is more interesting to them, having a harder time staying focused. We might also see that they have difficulty waiting for his or her turn. And so I can attest to many of these areas of inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. I myself as an adult do have ADHD. Now I have a mild case of ADHD, but it specifically came imperative that this was something I needed to focus on when I was in my schooling years. So I did have difficulty with paying attention during testing and staying on task during the time that I was in the classroom. So do notice if these are some of the behaviors within a typical day when you're interacting with a child who's between the ages of 6 and 12, that they may have some form of mild ADHD. Again, some inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactivity are perfectly common for children during this age group, but if there is an increased amount that is hindering their abilities to focus on a task or complete work on time, this could be an area of a learning disorder. Last but not least, I wanted to include a slide on inclusion in schools. I feel that it's important to talk about this when we are discussing developmental areas that children have disabilities, disorders, and/or delays, because inclusion can be a wonderful implementation within our school systems to make sure that everybody has active participation. Students with and without disabilities benefit from inclusion within the classroom. And so when we're thinking about inclusion within the schools, we see that we want children to have the least restrictive environment. And so this is where we have children who do and do not have disabilities in the same classroom with a general education teacher, but there are levels within educational placements. And so some children may be having their own individualized education plan that shows that the most that they will have within a general education classroom is only occasionally, or sometimes they might see their peers who do not have disabilities because they might be in a separate classroom in the school, or their abilities to participate in certain activities require them to have additional professionals within the classroom setting. We also see that some children may be in completely separate schools with students who all have disabilities, where they might choose to have home education and be homeschooled. And so do consider that there are different levels of placements of children with and without disabilities, and we mainly want to make sure that we're focusing on response to intervention. So how do we support children within the classroom? And so you'll notice here that the second tier, that is the light green, talks about regular classroom accommodations and modifications. And so do consider that you can make accommodations even if a child doesn't have them set in place by their IEP plan. So their individualized education plan is basically just a document that states that the school and the families and the child all have an action plan and goals set in place for what is needed for the child. But sometimes we make accommodations without even needing a set plan in place. So maybe I'm going to make sure that I go over information 2 or 3 times and practice everybody repeating it with me, or maybe I decide that I'm going to put children in small groups so that I have an opportunity to work with them individually, or I give extended time on testing for everybody. So I did include a little video that supports inclusion in schools that I'd recommend that you take a peek at. And do think about that if you're wanting to work within a school setting, there are many other professions that you could go into besides just being a general education teacher. You may want to be a special education teacher, or a therapist, or a paraprofessional. And there are many different kinds of therapists that you could be to support children who have physical disabilities. So you could be a occupational therapist, where they focus on helping children or individuals who need support with everyday tasks, or you might be a paraprofessional who comes into the classroom and supports children with one-on-one. So there are many different things that you might do within a school setting to support students with disabilities.